The steel handcuffs clicked shut around Lieutenant Commander Sofia Reeves' wrists with a sound that echoed through the concrete corridors of Blackwater Correctional Facility. The guards smirked as they shoved the decorated Navy SEAL into cell block D, certain that the reinforced bars and maximum security protocols would hold even the military's most elite operative. What they didn't realize was that they had just made the biggest mistake of their careers, because Navy SEALs don't need keys to get out of anywhere they don't want to be. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain hammered against the barred windows of Blackwater Correctional Facility as Sofia adjusted her orange jumpsuit for what felt like the 100th time in 3 days. At 29, she was one of only 12 women to have ever completed Navy SEAL training, a distinction that had earned her respect in the most elite military circles and resentment in others. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and her steel-gray eyes held a calm intensity that made even the most hardened criminals in the facility give her a wide berth. Blackwater wasn't just any prison. Located in the remote mountains of northern Montana, it housed some of the country's most dangerous federal inmates, including several former military personnel who had gone rogue. The facility was known for its brutal conditions, corrupt guards, and a warden who ruled with an iron fist. It was also completely off the grid, no media attention, no oversight committees, and no one asking uncomfortable questions about what happened behind its walls. Sofia's presence at Blackwater was the result of what her lawyer called catastrophic miscarriage of justice. 3 weeks earlier, she had been part of a classified mission that had gone sideways in spectacular fashion. When the smoke cleared, millions of dollars in military equipment was missing. 2 operatives were dead, and Sofia was the only one left alive to take the blame. Despite her protests of innocence and her spotless 15-year service record, a military tribunal had found her guilty of treason, theft of government property, and the deaths of her teammates. The evidence against her had been overwhelming security footage that appeared to show her stealing classified documents, financial records indicating large deposits to offshore accounts in her name, and testimony from a supposed witness who claimed to have seen her making contact with foreign agents. It was all fabricated, Sofia knew, but fabricated so perfectly that even she had to admire the craftsmanship of whoever had set her up. The real betrayal had come from Colonel Marcus Thornfield, her commanding officer and someone she had trusted with her life on more than one occasion. Thornfield had been the one to recommend her for the mission, the one to provide the intelligence that led them into the trap, and the one to testify against her at the tribunal. His promotion to general had been announced the same day her guilty verdict was read. Now, as Sofia surveyed her new home for the next 25 years, she could hear the jeers and catcalls from the other inmates echoing through the cell block. To them, she was fresh meat, a military officer who had fallen from grace, someone they could use to work out their grievances against the system that had put them here. What they didn't know was that Sofia Reeves had survived Taliban ambushes in Afghanistan, had swum through shark-infested waters off the coast of Somalia, and had single-handedly extracted a kidnapped diplomat from a terrorist compound in Syria. The cell block itself was a monument to human misery. 3 tiers of cells stretched along both sides of a central corridor, each one containing 2 bunks, a small metal toilet, and barely enough room for 2 people to stand without touching. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and something else Sofia couldn't quite identify. Desperation, perhaps. Or maybe just the accumulated weight of broken dreams and shattered lives. Her cellmate was a woman named Carmen Vasquez, a former gang leader from Los Angeles who had been convicted of running a drug operation that stretched across 3 states. Carmen was in her early 40s, with intricate tattoos covering her arms and a reputation for violence that had earned her respect even among the male inmates. She had been watching Sofia with undisguised curiosity since the moment the guards had thrown her into the cell. "So you're the Navy SEAL everyone's been talking about," Carmen said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "The one who supposedly sold out her country for money." "Allegedly," Sofia replied calmly, sitting down on the lower bunk that had been assigned to her. Carmen laughed, a sound without humor. "Honey, everyone in here is allegedly guilty of something. The question is what you're planning to do about it." Before Sofia could respond, the cell block erupted in noise as the evening meal was announced. Hundreds of inmates began filing out of their cells, forming rough lines that moved with the efficiency of long practice toward the mess hall. Sofia followed Carmen, noting the way other inmates stared at her, with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. The mess hall was a cavern of echoing voices and clattering metal trays. Sofia moved through the line, accepting portions of what the kitchen staff generously called food, and followed Carmen to a table near the back corner. She had been eating for less than 5 minutes when she felt the presence of someone standing behind her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Well, what do we have here?" The voice was gravelly and aggressive, belonging to a woman Sofia estimated to be in her late 30s. When she turned around, she found herself face to face with someone who looked like she could bench press a small car. The woman's name tag read Rodriguez, and from the deference shown by the other inmates, Sofia gathered she was someone important in the prison hierarchy. "Heard we got ourselves a real live war hero," Rodriguez continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Someone who forgot which side she was supposed to be fighting for." Sofia set down her fork and looked up at Rodriguez with steady eyes. "Is there something you need?" The question seemed to amuse Rodriguez, who laughed and looked around at the gathering crowd of inmates. "Oh, I like this one. She's got some backbone. Tell me, Navy girl, what exactly did they teach you in that fancy training of yours? How to betray your country? How to get your teammates killed?" The mess hall had grown quieter, with conversation stopping as inmates sensed the potential for violence. Sofia could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, measuring her reaction, waiting to see if the decorated military officer would crumble under pressure or fight back. What none of them knew, not Rodriguez, not the watching inmates, not even the guards who were slowly moving closer to break up any potential fight, was that Sofia Reeves had been trained to survive in hostile environments where a single mistake could mean death. She had learned to read people like maps, to identify threats before they materialized, and to remain calm under pressure that would break ordinary individuals. More importantly, she had spent the last 3 days carefully observing the rhythms and patterns of Blackwater Correctional Facility. She had noted the shift changes, the security blind spots, the weaknesses in the supposedly impregnable fortress that now held her. Because while the military tribunal might have branded her a traitor, and while these inmates might see her as an easy target, Sofia knew something that no one else in this room suspected. She wasn't planning to serve 25 years in this place. She wasn't even planning to serve 25 days. And when the time came to prove her innocence and expose the real traitors who had destroyed her life, these steel bars and reinforced concrete walls would prove to be nothing more than minor inconveniences for someone who had been trained by the finest military in the world to overcome impossible odds. The confrontation with Rodriguez was just beginning, but for Sofia, it was simply the first move in a much larger game one, where the stakes were her freedom, her reputation, and quite possibly her life. Sofia Reeves had never imagined that her journey to becoming one of the Navy's most elite operatives would lead her to a concrete cell in the middle of nowhere. But then again, life had a way of delivering curveballs when you least expected them. Born in the small coastal town of Sea Haven, Oregon, Sofia had grown up as the daughter of a commercial fisherman who disappeared during a storm when she was 12 years old. Her mother, Elena, had worked 3 jobs to keep their small family afloat, instilling in Sofia a work ethic that bordered on obsessive and a determination that refused to accept defeat. The military had always called to Sofia, but not in the way most people expected. While her high school classmates were dreaming of college parties and easy majors, Sofia was studying maritime navigation, learning advanced swimming techniques, and spending her free time rock climbing along the treacherous cliffs that lined Oregon's coastline. Her guidance counselor had suggested she consider becoming a physical education teacher or maybe joining the Coast Guard, but Sofia had set her sights considerably higher. Navy SEAL training had been the most brutal 18 months of her life. Of the 200 candidates who had started the program, only 23 had made it through to graduation, and Sofia had been the only woman. She had endured hypothermia during underwater demolitions training, had carried 200-pound logs through sand dunes until her shoulders bled, and had been pushed to psychological breaking points that would have shattered most people. But she had also discovered reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known existed within her. The instructors had nicknamed her Ice Queen, not because she was cold or unfeeling, but because of her ability to remain calm and focused under the most extreme pressure. While other candidates cursed, screamed, or broke down during the most challenging exercises, Sofia had developed an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize pain, fear, and exhaustion. She could slow her heart rate through pure mental discipline, could function effectively on 2 hours of sleep for weeks at a time, and could make split-second tactical decisions, even while under enemy fire. Her specialty had become underwater operations and maritime infiltration. Sofia could hold her breath for over 6 minutes, could navigate in complete darkness using only subtle changes in water temperature and current, and had once successfully infiltrated a terrorist stronghold by swimming 3 miles through open ocean while carrying 60 pounds of equipment. Her mission record was flawless: 15 successful operations across 4 continents, with 0 casualties among her team members and 0 compromised objectives. That perfect record was exactly what made her current situation so devastating. In the unforgiving world of special operations, reputation was everything. A single failed mission could end a career, and accusations of treason were tantamount to a death sentence for anyone hoping to continue serving their country. Sofia had built her identity around being someone her teammates could trust with their lives, someone who would never compromise mission security, and someone who exemplified the Navy's core values of honor, courage, and commitment. The mission that had destroyed her life had been designated Operation Seahawk, an infiltration of a suspected arms dealer's compound in Eastern Europe. Intelligence had suggested that Viktor Petrov, a former Russian military officer, was selling advanced American weapons technology to terrorist organizations. Sofia's team had been tasked with gathering evidence of Petrov's activities and, if possible, recovering any stolen technology. From the beginning, something had felt wrong about the mission. The intelligence had been too clean, too convenient, with every detail falling into place like pieces of a puzzle that had been pre-arranged. Sofia had expressed her concerns to Colonel Thornfield, but he had assured her that the information had come from a highly reliable source and that the mission was critical to national security. Against her better judgment, Sofia had led her team into what she now realized had been a carefully orchestrated trap. The ambush had been swift and brutal. Within minutes of entering Petrov's compound, Sofia's team had found themselves surrounded by mercenaries who knew exactly where they would be and exactly how they would approach. Sergeant Michael Chun and Petty Officer David Martinez, 2 of the finest operators Sofia had ever worked with, had been killed in the first exchange of gunfire. Sofia had barely escaped with her life, and only because she had been carrying equipment for the underwater extraction route that had been planned as their emergency exit, swimming through 3 miles of frozen river water while being pursued. by armed mercenaries had been a nightmare that still haunted Sofia's dreams. She had reached the extraction point only to find it empty, no backup team, no evacuation helicopter, no support of any kind. For 6 hours, she had hidden in the reeds along the riverbank, watching as Petrov's men searched for her with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested military training. When Sofia had finally made it back to base, she had expected debriefing sessions, investigation into how the mission had been compromised, and support for dealing with the loss of her teammates. Instead, she had been immediately placed under arrest and informed that evidence suggested she had been the one who had leaked the mission details to Petrov. The accusations had been so absurd, so completely contrary to everything Sofia stood for, that at first she had assumed it was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. The evidence that had been presented against her at the military tribunal had been devastating in its completeness. Security camera footage showed her accessing classified files that she supposedly had no business reading. Bank records indicated deposits of substantial sums of money to accounts that had been opened in her name. Most damaging of all, a witness, a CIA operative whose identity was classified, had testified that he had personally observed Sofia meeting with known associates of Viktor Petrov in a Prague hotel bar 3 weeks before the mission. Sofia knew that every piece of evidence had been fabricated, but the fabrication had been so skillful that she had begun to doubt her own memories. Could she have been drugged? Could someone have used advanced technology to create false footage? Could her own government have decided that she was expendable, a convenient scapegoat for an operation that had gone horribly wrong? The only explanation that made sense was that someone with access to the highest levels of military intelligence had orchestrated her downfall. Someone who knew her well enough to predict her actions, who had the authority to manipulate evidence and witnesses, and who had the motivation to see her destroyed. Colonel Marcus Thornfield fit all of those criteria perfectly. Thornfield had been Sofia's mentor for the past 5 years. The officer who had recruited her for special operations and who had guided her career through its most challenging phases. She had trusted him completely, had shared with him her doubts and fears, and had looked to him as something approaching a father figure. The possibility that he had betrayed her, that he had sacrificed Chin and Martinez as part of some larger scheme, was almost too painful to consider. But as Sofia sat in her cell at Blackwater, staring at the concrete walls that were supposed to contain her for the next 25 years, she allowed herself to consider all the possibilities. If Thornfield was behind her downfall, then he had to have had a compelling reason. Money was the most obvious motivation, but Thornfield came from old military money and had never shown any interest in material wealth. Power seemed more likely. A promotion to general was worth millions of dollars over the course of a career. And eliminating Sofia might have removed an obstacle to his advancement. There was also the possibility that Thornfield had been compromised himself, that he was being blackmailed or coerced by someone with even more power. The world of military intelligence was full of shadowy figures who operated outside normal chains of command. People who could make careers disappear with a phone call, and who measured success in terms of geopolitical outcomes rather than individual lives. Whatever the truth was, Sofia was determined to uncover it. She had spent 15 years learning to overcome impossible obstacles, to survive in hostile environments, and to complete missions that others considered hopeless. Being framed for treason and imprisoned in a maximum security facility was certainly challenging, but it was hardly the most difficult situation she had faced. The key was patience. Sofia had learned during her SEAL training that the most successful operations were those that took time to develop, that built slowly and methodically toward a decisive moment of action. She would need to understand the dynamics of Blackwater, to identify potential allies and threats, and to gather intelligence about who was really running the facility and what their weaknesses might be. She would also need to stay in fighting shape, both physically and mentally. The prison environment was designed to break people down, to strip away their sense of self-worth and their belief in the possibility of redemption. Sofia had seen strong people crumble under far less pressure than what she was now facing. And she knew that maintaining her edge would require constant vigilance. Most importantly, she would need to remember who she was. Not the traitor that the tribunal had branded her. Not the inmate that Blackwater was trying to create. But Lieutenant Commander Sofia Reeves, Navy SEAL. Someone who had sworn an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Someone who had never failed a mission and who didn't plan to start now. As she lay on her narrow bunk that first night, listening to the sounds of the prison settling around her, Sofia began to plan. She had been given a life sentence, but life sentences only mattered if you planned to serve them. And Sofia Reeves had no intention of spending the rest of her life behind bars for crimes she didn't commit. The guards might think that steel handcuffs and concrete walls were enough to hold a Navy SEAL. But they were about to discover that they had seriously underestimated their newest prisoner. The steel door of cell block D slammed shut behind Warden Rebecca, the Iron Maiden Castellanos, as she made her evening rounds, her polished boots echoing against the concrete floor with military precision. At 52, Castellanos had built her reputation on the principle that Blackwater Correctional Facility was where careers came to die, both for the inmates and for anyone foolish enough to challenge her authority. Standing 6 feet tall with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a severe bun, she commanded respect through a combination of psychological manipulation and barely contained violence that had broken stronger people than the decorated Navy SEAL now residing in cell 247. Castellanos had served 20 years in the Army before transitioning to corrections, and she ran Blackwater like a military operation where she was the supreme commander. Her office walls were lined with commendations from various law enforcement agencies, photographs of her shaking hands with politicians and generals, and newspaper clippings documenting her success in maintaining order at facilities that other wardens had deemed unmanageable. What the official records didn't show was her methods, the systematic use of isolation, sleep deprivation, and strategic violence to crush the spirit of anyone who might threaten the delicate ecosystem of corruption and control she had cultivated. Her second in command was Captain Vincent "Crusher" Morrison, a former Marine drill instructor whose dismissal from the Corps for excessive brutality had made him perfectly suited for Castellanos' purposes. Morrison was built like a refrigerator with legs, standing 6'4" and weighing close to 300 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. His face bore the evidence of countless fights, both official and unofficial, and his hands were the size of dinner plates with knuckles that had been broken and reset so many times they resembled small boulders. Morrison had earned his nickname during his first week at Blackwater, when he had literally crushed the windpipe of an inmate who had made the mistake of spitting at him during a cell inspection. The official report had listed the death as suicide by hanging, but every inmate and guard in the facility knew the truth. Morrison didn't just enforce rules, he made examples. And he enjoyed his work with an enthusiasm that made even the most hardened criminals give him a wide berth. Guard staff at Blackwater was carefully selected for their combination of physical intimidation and moral flexibility. Lieutenant Sarah Viper Hendricks controlled the female cell blocks with a reputation for cruelty that exceeded even Morrison's. A former military police officer who had been discharged for conduct unbecoming, Hendricks had perfected the art of psychological torture, using isolation, temperature manipulation, and carefully orchestrated accidents to maintain control over the female population. Sergeant Jake Bloodhound Patterson ran the prison's intelligence network, a web of informants and surveillance that allowed Castellanos to know about potential problems before they materialized. Patterson had served in military intelligence before being caught selling classified information to foreign buyers, and he had brought his expertise in human manipulation to Blackwater. He could identify weakness, exploit fear, and turn prisoners against each other with an efficiency that would have impressed his former handlers at the CIA. The institutional culture at Blackwater was built around the principle of absolute dominance. New inmates were subjected to a systematic process of psychological breakdown, designed to eliminate any thoughts of resistance or escape. Those who showed signs of leadership or defiance were isolated in solitary confinement until their spirit broke. Those who adapted quickly to the prison hierarchy were rewarded with small privileges that made their existence marginally more tolerable. Castellanos had developed what she privately called the pyramid system, a carefully structured hierarchy where prisoners earned better treatment by informing on their fellow inmates, by participating in the various illegal enterprises that generated revenue for the corrupt staff, or by providing entertainment through organized fights that satisfied the guards' appetite for violence. At the top of the pyramid were the trustees, long-term inmates who had proven their loyalty to the administration and who helped maintain order in exchange for special privileges. Below, the trustees were the general population inmates, who survived by keeping their heads down, following orders, and accepting their role as cogs in Castellano's machine. At the bottom were the troublemakers, the political prisoners, and anyone who represented a potential threat to the established order. These inmates lived in constant fear, subjected to random searches, unexplained disciplinary actions, and the ever-present possibility of accidents that would remove them permanently from the equation. The physical infrastructure of Blackwater had been designed to support this system of control. The facility was built in a star pattern, with 5 separate cell blocks radiating out from a central hub that housed the administrative offices and guard stations. Each cell block was essentially a self-contained environment that could be sealed off from the others in case of emergency. And the central location of the guard stations allowed for constant surveillance of all inmate movement. The cells themselves were deliberately cramped and uncomfortable, designed to create stress and conflict between cellmates. The common areas were monitored by a network of cameras and microphones that recorded everything, and the information gathered was used to identify potential problems and to gather blackmail material that could be used against inmates who might otherwise resist the prison's authority. The dining facilities were arranged to maximize tension and the potential for conflict. Different cell blocks were fed at different times, but the scheduling was deliberately irregular to prevent inmates from establishing routines or forming predictable alliances. The food itself was deliberately poor quality, not quite bad enough to generate complaints from outside oversight agencies, but sufficiently unappetizing to maintain a constant level of stress and dissatisfaction. Medical care at Blackwater was provided by Dr. Marcus Butcher Holloway, a physician who had lost his license to practice in civilian settings after being caught conducting unauthorized experiments on patients. Holloway's approach to medical treatment was guided by his belief that inmates deserved whatever suffering they experienced, and he had developed a reputation for misdiagnosing serious conditions and for providing inadequate treatment that prolonged pain and suffering. The prison's educational and recreational programs existed primarily on paper, designed to satisfy federal requirements rather than to provide genuine opportunities for rehabilitation. The library consisted of a small collection of outdated books that had been carefully screened to remove anything that might provide useful information about legal rights or escape techniques. The exercise yard was available for only 2 hours per day, and the equipment was deliberately maintained in poor condition to minimize its effectiveness. What made Castellanos particularly dangerous was her intelligence and her understanding of the political dynamics that allowed Blackwater to operate without meaningful oversight. She had cultivated relationships with local politicians, federal oversight officials, and media representatives that ensured that any complaints about conditions at the facility were either ignored or discredited. She had also developed an extensive network of contacts within the military and intelligence communities that provided her with advance warning of any investigations or inspections. The financial operations of Blackwater were built around a complex web of illegal enterprises that generated substantial revenue for Castellanos and her staff. These included smuggling operations that brought drugs, weapons, and other contraband into the facility, extortion schemes that extracted money from inmates' families in exchange for protection, and human trafficking operations that provided prisoners for illegal fighting, competitions, and other forms of entertainment for wealthy clients. Castellanos had also developed relationships with several private military contractors who used Blackwater as a testing ground for new interrogation techniques and psychological manipulation methods. These contractors paid substantial fees for access to the prison population, and they provided Castellanos with advanced training and equipment that made her control over the facility even more complete. The arrival of Sofia Reeves had created an unprecedented challenge for Castellanos. Navy SEALs were trained to resist interrogation, to maintain operational security under extreme pressure, and to escape from seemingly impossible situations. More troubling was Sofia's reputation for leadership and her potential to inspire other inmates to resist the established order at Blackwater. Castellanos had dealt with former military personnel before, but never someone with Sofia's level of training and experience. Her initial strategy was to place Sofia in the most violent cell block, pair her with the most dangerous possible cellmate, and wait for the inevitable conflict that would either break her spirit or eliminate her as a threat. What Castellanos didn't understand was that she was dealing with someone who had been trained to thrive in exactly these kinds of hostile environments. The challenge facing Sofia was not just surviving in Blackwater, but doing so while maintaining the physical and psychological edge that would be necessary for any eventual escape attempt. The prison was designed to wear down even the strongest individuals through constant stress, inadequate nutrition, and the psychological pressure of living in fear. But Sofia had been trained to operate effectively under conditions that would destroy ordinary people, and she had resources that Castellanos couldn't anticipate or understand. As Sofia settled into the brutal routine of life at Blackwater, she began to understand that she was facing more than just a corrupt prison system. She was confronting a carefully constructed machine designed to break human beings and reshape them, according to the twisted vision of someone who had turned cruelty into an art form. The question was whether her training and determination would be enough to not just survive, but to eventually turn Castellanos' own system against her. The war between Sofia Reeves and Rebecca Castellanos was just beginning, and both women understood that only one of them would emerge victorious from the concrete and steel battleground of Blackwater Correctional Facility. The fluorescent lights in the administrative wing of Blackwater hummed with an ominous frequency as Deputy Director Thomas the Architect Blackstone reviewed the classified file that arrived via encrypted courier that morning. At 61 years old, Blackstone represented the shadowy intersection between government intelligence operations and private corrections, a man whose official title barely hinted at the scope of his actual influence. His corner office overlooked the prison yard through bulletproof glass, but his attention was focused entirely on the document that threatened to append carefully laid plans that had been years in the making. The file contained a single photograph of Sofia Reeves in her Navy dress uniform, along with a service record that read like a catalog of America's most sensitive military operations. What made Blackstone's hands tremble slightly as he turned the pages wasn't Sofia's impressive list of accomplishments, but rather the handwritten note clipped to the inside cover. Project Nightfall, immediate. Implementation required. Authority level Omega. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone whose name appeared on no organizational charts, but whose word carried the weight of national security directives. Blackstone had spent 35 years navigating the murky waters where legitimate government operations intersected with activities that could never appear in official reports. He had overseen black sites in Eastern Europe, had managed asset extraction operations in hostile territories, and had coordinated the elimination of problems that threatened to expose operations vital to national security. Blackwater Correctional Facility was supposed to be his retirement project, a place where he could apply his expertise in human psychology and organizational control to a more mundane environment. The prison served multiple purposes beyond its official designation as a federal correctional facility. It was a testing ground for advanced interrogation techniques, a black site where individuals who knew too much about sensitive operations could be permanently isolated, and a recruitment center where desperate inmates could be evaluated for participation in deniable operations. The most valuable aspect of Blackwater was its complete isolation from oversight. Federal inspectors could be managed, media attention could be deflected, and the remote location made unauthorized surveillance virtually impossible. Blackstone's partnership with Warden Castellanos had been cultivated over several years as he recognized her unique combination of administrative competence and moral flexibility. She understood that running an effective correctional facility sometimes required methods that wouldn't appear in any training manual, and she had proven her reliability through her handling of several previous cases involving individuals whose imprisonment served broader strategic purposes. In return, Blackstone ensured that her facility received generous federal funding and that any complaints about conditions at Blackwater disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. The arrival of Sofia Reeves had initially been viewed as simply another routine case, a decorated military officer whose knowledge of classified operations made her a potential security risk if she were housed in a standard federal facility. Her conviction for treason had provided the perfect cover for her transfer to Blackwater, where she could be kept isolated and monitored while her case faded from public memory. The plan had been straightforward: allow the prison environment to gradually break down her psychological defenses, then recruit her for operations where her skills could be useful and her loyalty could be ensured through a combination of incentives and threats. Project Nightfall changed everything. The operation had been conceived at the highest levels of the intelligence community as a response to a growing threat from an international criminal organization that had proven resistant to conventional law enforcement approaches. The organization, known only as the Syndicate, had infiltrated government agencies, military commands, and private corporations across multiple countries. They specialized in stealing advanced military technology and selling it to terrorists. Organizations and their security measures made traditional infiltration operations virtually impossible. The intelligence community had identified Sofia's former commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Thornfield, as a key figure in the Syndicate's operations. Thornfield's promotion to general had provided him with access to even more sensitive information, and his position made him essentially untouchable through normal channels. What the intelligence analysts had discovered was that Thornfield's betrayal of Sofia hadn't been motivated by personal advancement. It had been necessary to protect his role as the Syndicate's highest-placed asset within the American military. The plan was elegant in its complexity. Sofia would be allowed to escape from Blackwater under circumstances that would appear to be entirely her own initiative. Her escape would be detected just late enough to make recapture unlikely, and evidence would be planted suggesting that she had been aided by unknown accomplices with access to advanced resources. The manhunt that followed would be genuine, but Sofia would be provided with covert support that would allow her to remain at large while pursuing the evidence needed to expose Thornfield and his conspirators. The beauty of the operation was That Sofia's motivation would be entirely genuine. She would be seeking to clear her name and expose the people responsible for destroying her life and killing her teammates. Her actions would appear to be those of a rogue operative seeking revenge, providing perfect cover for what was actually a sanctioned intelligence operation designed to penetrate the syndicate at its highest levels. If the operation succeeded, Thornfield and his network could be eliminated. If it failed, Sofia could be eliminated as a rogue operative, and the intelligence community's role would remain completely hidden. Implementing Project Nightfall required careful coordination between multiple agencies and the creation of a complex web of apparent coincidences that would provide Sofia with the opportunity she needed to escape, while making her success appear to be the result of her own exceptional abilities. Blackstone's role was to ensure that the security failures at Blackwater appeared to be realistic mistakes rather than deliberate sabotage, and that Sofia's escape route would lead her toward the resources she would need to pursue her investigation. The first phase involved gradually reducing the psychological pressure on Sofia, while making it appear that she was adapting successfully to prison life. This would require careful management of Warden Castellanos, who would need to believe that her usual methods were working effectively while actually being manipulated into creating the conditions necessary for Sofia's eventual escape. Castellanos' predictable tendency toward overconfidence would be exploited to make her careless about security protocols at exactly the right moment. The second phase required the introduction of certain resources into the prison environment that Sofia could discover and repurpose for her escape attempt. These would include access to information about the facility's security systems, tools that could be adapted for breaking through barriers, and communication equipment that would allow her to coordinate with outside contacts. Everything would need to appear as though Sofia had obtained these resources through her own initiative and ingenuity. The most challenging aspect of the operation was ensuring that Sofia would pursue the right targets once she was free. This required the careful placement of information that would guide her investigation toward Thornfield and the syndicate, while making her believe that she was uncovering these leads independently. The trail would need to be compelling enough to motivate her continued pursuit, despite the enormous risks, but subtle enough to avoid raising suspicions about the true nature of her mission. Blackstone understood that Sofia's Navy SEAL training would make her naturally suspicious of coincidences and apparent lucky breaks. She would need to be convinced that her successes were the result of her own skills and determination rather than outside assistance. This meant that the support provided to her would need to be invisible, manifesting as apparent strokes of good fortune or the mistakes of her enemies rather than deliberate aid. The operation also required careful management of the law enforcement response to Sofia's escape. Local and federal agencies would mount a genuine manhunt, but certain key pieces of information would be withheld or delayed to ensure that Sofia maintained the freedom of movement necessary to pursue her investigation. The challenge was creating enough of a genuine threat to make her continued evasion appear impressive while ensuring that she wasn't actually captured or killed by overzealous agents. Perhaps the most complex element of Project Nightfall was the psychological manipulation required to ensure Sofia's cooperation without her knowledge. She would need to believe that she was acting entirely on her own initiative, motivated by her desire for justice and her determination to clear her name. The intelligence community's role would remain completely hidden until the moment when Sofia had gathered enough evidence to expose the syndicate, at which point she would be offered official reinstatement in exchange for her cooperation in the final phase of the operation. As Blackstone closed the classified file and locked it in his personal safe, he reflected on the irony of the situation. Sofia Reeves had been betrayed by people she trusted, framed for crimes she didn't commit, and imprisoned in a facility designed to break her spirit. What she didn't know was that her government hadn't abandoned her. They were simply using her imprisonment as cover for an operation that would allow her to destroy the people who had actually betrayed her country. The question that troubled Blackstone as he prepared to implement Project Nightfall was whether Sofia would ever forgive them for the deception, even if it ultimately restored her honor and eliminated a genuine threat to national security. The operation required her to suffer through experiences that would leave psychological scars lasting years, and there was no guarantee that she would understand or accept the justification for what had been done to her. But national security sometimes required sacrifices from people who never volunteered to make them. And Sofia Reeves was about to become an unwitting weapon in a war she didn't even know was being fought. The morning alarm at Blackwater pierced through the concrete corridors at precisely 5:30 a.m., sending 847 inmates shuffling toward another day of institutional routine. Sofia had been at the facility for 2 weeks now, long enough to understand the rhythms and patterns that governed life behind these walls, but not long enough to have lost the edge that separated her from the broken souls who populated the cells around her. She moved through her morning preparations with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her during SEAL training. Every action deliberate and economical. Her first real test had come during the 3rd day when Carmen Vasquez had decided to establish the pecking order in their shared cell. Carmen had 16 years of prison experience and a reputation built on violence that had earned her respect throughout the facility. She had assumed that Sofia, despite her military background, would be just another new fish who needed to learn her place in the complex social hierarchy that governed inmate interactions. The confrontation had been subtle at first. Small acts of disrespect like taking Sofia's soap during shower time, eating her dessert portion during meals, and making disparaging comments about military personnel who couldn't hack it in the real world. Sofia had absorbed these provocations without response, appearing to submit to Carmen's dominance while actually studying her cellmates' patterns and weaknesses. The breaking point had come when Carmen decided to search through Sofia's personal belongings while she was in the shower. Navy SEALs were trained to maintain operational security even in the most casual environments, and Sofia had developed an almost supernatural awareness of when her space had been disturbed. She had returned to find everything exactly where she had left it. But subtle indicators, a hair positioned across her toothbrush, microscopic threads placed in specific locations, told her that Carmen had conducted a thorough search. That night, as Carmen lay sleeping in the upper bunk, Sofia had demonstrated why Navy SEAL training included extensive instruction in close-quarters combat. She had applied a blood choke with such precision that Carmen had lost consciousness without ever fully awakening, experiencing only a gradually dimming awareness before slipping into unconsciousness. When Carmen awakened 30 seconds later, she found Sofia sitting calmly on her own bunk, reading a book as if nothing had happened. "You've got skills," Carmen had whispered, her voice hoarse from the pressure that had been applied to her throat. "But more importantly, you've got control. I can respect that." The incident had established Sofia's position within the cell block's informal hierarchy, but it had also attracted attention from inmates who saw her as either a potential threat or a valuable ally. The most significant of these was Isabella Queen Bee Rodriguez, the woman who had confronted Sofia during her first meal at Blackwater. Rodriguez controlled the female population through a combination of physical intimidation and psychological manipulation, and she had built a network of loyalists who provided her with information and carried out her orders throughout the facility. Rodriguez's approach to dealing with Sofia had been more sophisticated than Carmen's direct challenge. She had begun by testing Sofia's resolve through a series of increasingly aggressive provocations, designed to force her into a situation where she would have to either fight or submit publicly. The first test had come during exercise period when one of Rodriguez's lieutenants, A muscular woman named Diana Kozlov had accidentally knocked Sofia down while she was doing push-ups, then stood over her making comments about how military training apparently didn't prepare people for real prison life. Sofia had gotten to her feet, without apparent anger, dusted herself off, and resumed her exercise routine as if nothing had happened. But she had also made note of Kozlov's preferred workout times, her exercise patterns, and the blind spots in the yard where guards couldn't observe inmate interactions. 3 days later, Kozlov had found herself face down in the dirt after attempting to trip Sofia during a basketball game. The result of a perfectly timed, defensive move that appeared to be an accident, but left Kozlov with a dislocated shoulder and a new respect for Sofia's capabilities. Second test had involved Sofia's commissary privileges. Rodriguez's network controlled much of the informal economy within Blackwater, taking percentages from gambling operations, charging protection fees for weaker inmates, and manipulating the distribution of contraband items that made prison life more bearable. Sofia had been informed through intermediaries that she would be expected to pay a weekly tribute in exchange for being left alone, a standard arrangement that most inmates accepted as the cost of avoiding constant harassment. Sofia's response had been to politely decline the offer while making it clear that she understood the potential consequences. She had also begun documenting the extent of Rodriguez's operations, noting which guards appeared to be cooperating with the informal economy and identifying the methods used to smuggle contraband items into the facility. This information wasn't gathered for any immediate purpose. Sofia was still focused primarily on survival and maintaining her physical and psychological readiness, but her intelligence training had taught her to collect useful information whenever possible. The third test had been the most dangerous. Rodriguez had arranged for Sofia to be confronted by Angela Razor Morrison, Captain Morrison's sister, and a woman whose reputation for violence exceeded even that of her brother. Angela had been convicted of multiple counts of assault with deadly weapons and had earned her nickname through her preference for improvised blades. During fights, she had been serving a life sentence for nearly 8 years and had nothing to lose by adding another assault charge to her record. The confrontation had taken place in the laundry facility, where the noise of washing machines would mask any sounds of violence, and where the lack of security cameras created opportunities for incidents to occur without witnesses. Angela had cornered Sofia near the industrial dryers, armed with a sharpened piece of metal that had been carefully crafted to inflict maximum damage while being easily concealed. What happened next had become the subject of intense speculation throughout Blackwater. Witnesses reported seeing Angela approach Sofia aggressively, then suddenly stumble and fall against one of the dryers with enough force to dent the metal housing. When guards arrived to investigate the commotion, they found Angela unconscious with what appeared to be a concussion sustained from hitting her head on the dryer. Sofia had been nearby, folding laundry with the kind of calm concentration that suggested complete innocence. The official report had listed the incident as an accident. Angela had slipped on a wet spot on the floor and struck her head during the fall. But inmates throughout the facility understood that something more significant had occurred. Angela Morrison didn't slip and fall, and she certainly didn't end up unconscious unless someone with exceptional skills had put her there. More importantly, Sofia had managed to neutralize a deadly threat without leaving any evidence of deliberate action, demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that impressed even Rodriguez. The turning point in Sofia's relationship with the inmate population had come when she had chosen to provide medical assistance to a young woman named Katie Chun who had suffered what appeared to be a drug overdose in her cell. Katie was new to the facility, barely 21 years old, and had been struggling to adapt to the harsh realities of prison life. She had obtained some kind of contraband substance, probably smuggled prescription medication, and had taken too much in an apparent suicide attempt. Sofia had found Katie unconscious and barely breathing when she returned from the exercise yard. Rather than calling for guards, who would have taken several minutes to respond and who might have been more concerned with avoiding paperwork than saving a life, Sofia had immediately begun emergency medical procedures. Her Navy SEAL training had included extensive instruction in field medicine, and she had experience treating everything from gunshot wounds to drug overdoses in combat environments. She had positioned Katie to prevent aspiration, had monitored her vital signs, and had administered basic life support until the girl's breathing stabilized. Only then had she called for medical assistance, timing the request to make it appear that she had just discovered Katie's condition, rather than revealing that she had been treating her for several minutes. When Dr. Holloway had arrived, he found Katie in stable condition with vital signs that suggested she would recover completely. The incident had demonstrated Sofia's medical knowledge and her willingness to help other inmates despite the potential risks to herself. Word of her actions had spread quickly throughout the facility, enhancing her reputation among inmates who respected competence and loyalty while also attracting additional attention from guards who were beginning to view her as a potential security concern. Most significant development during Sofia's third week at Blackwater had been her first extended conversation with Warden Castellanos. The meeting had been arranged under the pretext of a routine psychological evaluation, but Sofia had understood immediately that she was being assessed for purposes that went far beyond standard correctional procedures. Castellanos had questioned her about her military background, her feelings about her conviction, and her plans for adapting to long-term incarceration. Sofia had provided careful responses that revealed nothing useful while creating the impression of gradual psychological submission to the prison environment. She had expressed appropriate remorse for her supposed crimes, had indicated that she was beginning to accept the reality of her situation, and had suggested that she might be interested in participating in prison work programs that would provide her with structure and purpose. It was exactly the kind of response that prison administrators wanted to hear from long-term inmates, and Castellanos had appeared satisfied that Sofia was progressing normally through the psychological adaptation process. What Castellanos didn't know was that Sofia was actually conducting her own assessment, gathering information about the warden's personality, motivations, and potential vulnerabilities. She had noted Castellanos' obvious pride in her facility's reputation, her sensitivity to any suggestion that she wasn't in complete control, and her tendency to view inmates as problems to be managed rather than human beings to be rehabilitated. This information would be valuable for any future interactions, and it provided insights into the psychological dynamics that governed Blackwater's operations. By the end of her third week, Sofia had established herself as a significant figure within the inmate population while maintaining the appearance of gradual adaptation to prison life. She had demonstrated her capabilities without revealing the full extent of her training, had built a network of contacts who provided her with information about facility operations, and had begun to understand the complex relationships between inmates, guards, and administrators that actually controlled daily life at Blackwater. More importantly, she had maintained the physical conditioning and psychological edge that would be essential for any future escape attempt. Her daily exercise routine continued to prepare her body for the extreme physical demands that would be required, while her mental discipline allowed her to remain focused on long-term objectives despite the constant stress of the prison environment. Sofia knew that she was still in the early stages of what would be a long and dangerous process, but she also knew that every day at Blackwater was teaching her more about the facility's weaknesses and providing her with opportunities to gather the resources she would eventually need. The guards might think that concrete walls and steel bars were enough to contain a Navy SEAL, but they were about to discover that they had seriously underestimated the determination and capabilities of their most dangerous prisoner. The autumn chill had settled over Blackwater like a suffocating blanket by Sofia's sixth week of incarceration, bringing with it a series of events that would fundamentally alter the delicate balance of power within the facility. The change began subtly, with the arrival of a new inmate whose presence would catalyze forces that had been building beneath the surface since Sofia's first day behind these concrete walls. Elena Vasquez entered Blackwater on a Tuesday morning, processed through the intake system with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had welcomed hundreds of women before her. But Elena was different from the typical federal prisoner. She was Carmen's younger sister, and she carried with her information that would threaten the carefully constructed ecosystem that Warden Castellanos had spent years developing. Elena had been a forensic accountant for the FBI before her conviction on charges of embezzling federal funds. Charges that she maintained were fabricated to silence her investigation into corruption within the Bureau's Financial Oversight Division. What made Elena's arrival particularly significant was her knowledge of Project Nightfall's financial infrastructure. During her tenure with the FBI, she had been tasked with tracking unusual expenditures and budget allocations across multiple agencies, and she had identified several patterns that suggested coordinated operations involving private contractors, correctional facilities, and intelligence agencies. Her investigation had been progressing when she was suddenly arrested on evidence that appeared to have been planted in her personal accounts. Sofia first encountered Elena during the evening meal on her third day at the facility. Carmen had requested permission to introduce them, explaining that her sister possessed skills that might prove valuable to Sofia's long-term survival strategy. Elena was 34 years old, slight of build, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of intense focus that came from spending years analyzing complex financial data. She spoke quietly and precisely, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood that information could be both weapon and shield. "Carmen tells me you're not like the other inmates here," Elena said as they found a table in the corner of the mess hall. "She says you have training that goes beyond what most people understand." Sofia studied Elena carefully before responding. "Your sister has been a good cellmate. She's taught me a lot about how things work here." Elena smiled slightly. "What she's taught you is how to survive the obvious threats. But there are other dangers here that most inmates never recognize. This facility isn't what it appears to be." Over the following days, Elena began sharing information that fundamentally changed Sofia's understanding of her situation at Blackwater. The facility's budget included line items for consulting services that had no clear purpose, equipment purchases that exceeded any reasonable correctional need, and personnel expenses that suggested a staff far larger than what was visible to the inmate population. More troubling were the financial connections between Blackwater and several private military contractors that specialized in intelligence operations. "Someone is using this place for purposes that go far beyond standard corrections," Elena explained during one of their carefully private conversations. "The money flow suggests psychological research, technology testing, and possibly human experimentation. Whatever you did to end up here, someone wanted you in this specific facility for reasons that have nothing to do with punishment." Sofia had already suspected that her placement at Blackwater wasn't coincidental, but Elena's financial analysis provided concrete evidence of institutional connections that extended far beyond the prison system. The implications were staggering if Elena was correct. Then Sofia's conviction and imprisonment were part of a larger operation that involved coordination between multiple government agencies and private contractors. Revelation coincided with a significant escalation in the file Psychological pressure being applied to Sofia by the prison administration. Dr. Holloway had begun requiring weekly sessions that were ostensibly focused on her mental health evaluation but actually seemed designed to probe her knowledge of classified operations and her psychological resilience. The sessions were recorded, and Sofia suspected that the recordings were being analyzed by specialists who understood interrogation techniques far more sophisticated than anything typically employed in correctional settings. During one particularly intensive session, Holloway had attempted to use pharmaceutical intervention to reduce Sofia's psychological defenses. He had claimed that she was showing signs of depression and anxiety that required medical treatment, prescribing medications that would have significantly impaired her cognitive function and emotional control. Sofia had refused the medication, citing religious objections, but she understood that future refusal might not be accepted so easily. The pressure from other inmates was also intensifying. Queen B. Rodriguez had begun orchestrating increasingly sophisticated tests of Sofia's resolve, using information that suggested she was receiving guidance from sources outside the normal prison hierarchy. The challenges were designed to force Sofia into situations where she would have to reveal the full extent of her capabilities or accept defeat that would destroy her position within the facility's social structure. The most significant challenge had come in the form of Maria Santos, a new arrival who had been strategically placed in Sofia's path during what should have been a routine interaction in the library. Maria was a former military intelligence officer who claimed to have been convicted of selling classified information to foreign buyers. She approached Sofia with an offer to share intelligence about security vulnerabilities within Blackwater, information that could potentially be useful for any escape attempt. Sofia's training had taught her to be suspicious of anyone who offered assistance without clear motivation, and Maria's approach had raised multiple red flags. Her knowledge of security procedures was too detailed for someone who had only been at the facility for a few days. Her background story contained inconsistencies that suggested fabrication, and her interest in Sofia's plan seemed more focused on gathering information than providing genuine assistance. The interaction with Maria had been a turning point in Sofia's understanding of her situation. She was clearly being subjected to sophisticated psychological operations that involved multiple layers of deception and manipulation. The question was whether these operations were being conducted by the prison administration, by outside agencies using Blackwater as a testing facility, or by hostile forces that had somehow infiltrated the institution. Elena's financial analysis had also revealed disturbing patterns in the facility's medical and disciplinary records. Inmates who showed signs of resistance or who possessed valuable skills were often subjected to extended periods of medical treatment that resulted in significant changes in their behavior and capabilities. The treatments were documented as standard psychiatric care, but the outcomes suggested more aggressive interventions that might include experimental drugs, psychological conditioning techniques. "They're not just holding people here," Elena had explained during one of their conversations. "They're changing them. Some inmates leave here fundamentally different from who they were when they arrived, and not in ways that suggest successful rehabilitation." The revelation had prompted Sofia to conduct her own investigation into the facility's operations, using skills developed during intelligence-gathering missions to map the relationships between staff members, identify unusual patterns in inmate movement, and document security procedures that seemed designed for purposes beyond standard corrections. Her findings had confirmed Elena's suspicions. Blackwater was operating as something far more complex than a simple federal prison. The most disturbing discovery had been the existence of a separate wing of the facility that didn't appear on any official blueprints, and that was accessible only to staff members with special clearances. Sofia had observed several inmates being escorted to this area during irregular hours, And she had noted that some of these individuals never returned to the general population. When she had inquired about their whereabouts, she had been told that they had been transferred to other facilities. But there were no records of such transfers in the administrative systems that Alina had been able to access. Sofia's investigation had also revealed sophisticated surveillance equipment that went far beyond what would be expected in a correctional environment. The facility was equipped with biometric monitoring systems that could track stress levels, emotional responses, and even detect deception during conversations. This information was being collected and analyzed by staff members whose background suggested expertise in psychological operations rather than corrections. Breakthrough in Sofia's understanding of her situation came when Alina managed to access financial records that revealed the true source of Blackwater's funding. The facility was receiving substantial payments from a consortium of government agencies and private contractors that were coordinating activities under the umbrella of something called Project Nightfall. The payments were structured to support operations that included psychological research, technology testing, and what the documents euphemistically referred to as human resource development. "You're not here by accident," Alina had told Sofia after reviewing the financial data. "Someone wanted you in this specific place, under these specific conditions, for reasons that are probably connected to your military background and the circumstances of your conviction. The question is whether they're trying to break you down or build you up for something else." The realization that her imprisonment was part of a larger operation had profound implications for Sofia's escape planning. If outside agencies were monitoring her progress and manipulating her environment, then any escape attempt would need to account for opposition that extended far beyond the prison's normal security measures. She would be facing enemies who understood her capabilities, who could predict her likely strategies, and who might be prepared to counter her moves before she made them. But the revelation also presented opportunities. If Sofia was being held at Blackwater for purposes related to Project Nightfall, then the people controlling the operation might have reasons to facilitate her escape under the right circumstances. The challenge would be determining what those circumstances were and how she could manipulate them to her advantage. As Sofia lay in her cell that night, listening to the sounds of the prison settling around her, she understood that she was facing a situation far more complex than anything her SEAL training had prepared her for. She wasn't just fighting to escape from prison. She was fighting to escape from an operation that involved some of the most sophisticated intelligence and psychological manipulation capabilities that the government possessed. The steel bars and concrete walls of Blackwater were only the most visible barriers containing her. The real prison was constructed from lies, manipulation, and institutional power that extended far beyond anything she could fight with physical force alone. But Sofia had learned during her military career that the most formidable enemies often created their own weaknesses through overconfidence and complexity. And she was beginning to identify cracks in the seemingly impenetrable system that held her. The war for her freedom was about to begin in earnest. And Sofia was finally beginning to understand the true nature of the battlefield on which she would be fighting. The gray dawn light filtered through the reinforced windows of cell Block D as Sofia completed her morning routine with mechanical precision, each movement calculated to maintain the physical readiness that would be essential for what was coming. It had been 10 weeks since her arrival at Blackwater, and the facility had settled into a deceptive calm that she recognized as the precursor to significant action. Her intelligence gathering had reached a critical mass. Elena's financial analysis had revealed the scope of the conspiracy surrounding her imprisonment, and the psychological pressure from the administration had intensified to levels that suggested an approaching climax. The catalyst for the final confrontation had arrived 3 days earlier in the form of a new directive from Deputy Director Blackstone. Sofia had observed the unusual activity among the administrative staff, encrypted communications at all hours, additional security personnel arriving under the cover of routine transfers, and modifications to the facility's electronic systems that suggested preparation for something far beyond normal correctional operations. Elena's access to financial systems had been suddenly restricted, and several inmates who had been providing Sofia with intelligence about facility operations had been transferred to other institutions without explanation. That Dr. Holloway's psychological evaluations had become increasingly aggressive, incorporating techniques that bordered on interrogation rather than therapy. During her most recent session, he had attempted to use pharmaceutical enhancement to break down her psychological defenses, claiming that her continued resistance to treatment indicated dangerous mental instability that required immediate intervention. Sofia had been forced to submit to blood tests and neurological examinations that were clearly designed to assess her physical and mental condition for purposes that had nothing to do with medical care. They're preparing for something, Elena had warned during one of their final private conversations. The financial authorizations I've seen suggest a major operation is being planned, and the timeline indicates it's happening soon. Whatever Project Nightfall is really about, you're approaching the moment when they'll either use you or eliminate you. The pressure from the inmate population had also reached critical levels. Queen Bee Rodriguez had exhausted her repertoire of indirect challenges and had begun making direct threats that suggested she was operating under instructions from sources outside the normal prison hierarchy. Her network of informants had been tasked with documenting Sofia's daily routines, her physical capabilities, and her psychological responses to stress. Information that was clearly being passed to administrators who were planning some kind of decisive action. The breaking point had come during the evening meal when Rodriguez approached Sofia's table with an entourage that included her most dangerous lieutenants. The mess hall had grown quiet as inmates sensed the potential for violence, and even the guards had positioned themselves to observe what was clearly going to be a significant confrontation. "Time's up, Navy girl," Rodriguez had announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent dining area. "You've been playing games since you got here, acting like you're better than everyone else. But this is my house, and in my house, everyone pays their respects or they pay the price." Sofia had continued eating calmly, not acknowledging Rodriguez's presence while internally calculating the tactical situation. She was outnumbered 5-1, surrounded by hostile inmates, and under observation by guards who might intervene to protect her or might allow the situation to escalate according to some predetermined plan. Her choices were to submit publicly to Rodriguez's dominance, which would destroy her position within the facility's social hierarchy, or to resist, which would force her to reveal capabilities that she had been carefully concealing. "I respect competence and loyalty," Sofia had replied without looking up from her meal. "When I see those qualities, I'll show appropriate respect." The insult had been delivered so calmly that it took Rodriguez several seconds to process its full implications. When she did, her response was swift and violent, launching herself across the table with a homemade weapon that had been concealed in her sleeve. But Sofia had been expecting the attack, had been watching Rodriguez's body language for the telltale signs of imminent violence, and had been prepared to respond with techniques that would neutralize the threat while minimizing her own exposure. What happened next occurred in less than 3 seconds but would be analyzed and discussed by inmates and staff for months afterward. Sofia had moved with a fluidity and precision that seemed almost supernatural, deflecting Rodriguez's weapon while simultaneously controlling her attacker's momentum and redirecting it into the steel table with devastating effect. Rodriguez had struck the metal surface with enough force to fracture her cheekbone and dislocate her shoulder. effectively ending the fight. Before her supporters could intervene, the mess hall had erupted in chaos as inmates either cheered or fled. Guards rushed to restore order, and Rodriguez lay groaning on the floor with injuries that would require immediate medical attention. Sofia had remained seated throughout the aftermath, calmly finishing her meal while medical personnel attended to her defeated opponent. When questioned by guards about what had happened, she had simply stated that Rodriguez had slipped and fallen while attempting to sit down, an explanation that was obviously false, but impossible to disprove given the speed with which the incident had occurred. Confrontation had established Sofia as the undisputed leader of the female inmate population, but it had also attracted the kind of attention that she had been trying to avoid. Within hours, she had been summoned to Warden Castellanos' office for what was described as a routine disciplinary hearing but was actually an interrogation designed to assess her psychological state and determine whether she represented a threat to facility security. Castellanos had approached the meeting with the kind of cold professionalism that Sofia recognized from her encounters with intelligence officers who specialized in psychological manipulation. The warden's questions had been carefully constructed to probe Sofia's motivations, her long-term plans, and her knowledge of information that could be damaging to facility operations. More significantly, Castellanos had revealed knowledge of Sofia's military background that went far beyond what should have been available in standard correctional files. "You're an interesting case, Lieutenant Commander," Castellanos had said, using Sofia's military rank rather than her inmate designation. Navy SEAL training, extensive combat experience, expertise in underwater operations and infiltration techniques. Someone with your background doesn't end up at Blackwater by accident. Sofia had maintained a neutral expression while internally noting that Castellanos possessed classified information about her service, record that should have been accessible only to individuals with the highest levels of security clearance. The revelation confirmed her suspicions about the true nature of Blackwater and the purposes for which she was being held there. "I'm serving my sentence and trying to adapt to institutional life," Sofia had replied carefully. "The incident with Rodriguez was self-defense. She attacked me, and I responded with minimal necessary force." Castellanos had smiled with the kind of cold amusement that suggested she knew far more about the situation than she was revealing. "Minimal necessary force. Yes, I imagine that's how they taught you to describe it in your after-action reports. Tell me, do you miss the work? The adrenaline of combat operations, the satisfaction of completing impossible missions, the camaraderie of working with elite operators who understood your capabilities?" The questions had been designed to provoke an emotional response that would provide Castellanos with insights into Sofia's psychological vulnerabilities. But Sofia had spent 15 years learning to compartmentalize her emotions and maintain operational security even under extreme pressure. She had provided appropriate responses that revealed nothing useful while gathering information about Castellanos' knowledge and motivations. The meeting had concluded with Castellanos issuing a warning that was actually a threat disguised as administrative policy. "I want you to understand that this facility operates according to strict rules that apply to everyone, regardless of their background or training. Inmates who demonstrate that they can't adapt to our institutional culture find that their stay here becomes significantly more challenging." As Sofia had returned to her cell, she had understood that the psychological warfare phase of her imprisonment was ending, and that direct confrontation was approaching. Castellanos and her associates had completed their assessment of Sofia's capabilities and were preparing to implement whatever plan they had been developing since her arrival at Blackwater. The challenge was determining what that plan involved. The pressure from the inmate population had also reached critical levels. Queen Bee Rodriguez had exhausted her repertoire of indirect challenges and had begun making direct threats that suggested she was operating under instructions from sources outside the normal prison hierarchy. Her network of informants had been tasked with documenting Sofia's daily routines, her physical capabilities, and her psychological responses to stress. Information that was clearly being passed to administrators who were planning some kind of decisive action. The breaking point had come during the evening meal when Rodriguez approached Sofia's table with an entourage that included her most dangerous lieutenants. The mess hall had grown quiet as inmates sensed the potential for violence, and even the guards had positioned themselves to observe what was clearly going to be a significant confrontation. "Time's up, Navy girl," Rodriguez had announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent dining area. "You've been playing games since you got here, acting like you're better than everyone else. But this is my house, and in my house, everyone pays their respects or they pay the price." Sofia had continued eating calmly, not acknowledging Rodriguez's presence while internally calculating the tactical situation. She was outnumbered 5-1, surrounded by hostile inmates, and under observation by guards who might intervene to protect her or might allow the situation to escalate according to some predetermined plan. Her choices were to submit publicly to Rodriguez's dominance, which would destroy her position within the facility's social hierarchy, or to resist, which would force her to reveal capabilities that she had been carefully concealing. "I respect competence and loyalty," Sofia had replied without looking up from her meal. "When I see those qualities, I'll show appropriate respect." The insult had been delivered so calmly that it took Rodriguez several seconds to process its full implications. When she did, her response was swift and violent, launching herself across the table with a homemade weapon that had been concealed in her sleeve. But Sofia had been expecting the attack, had been watching Rodriguez's body language for the telltale signs of imminent violence, and had been prepared to respond with techniques that would neutralize the threat while minimizing her own exposure. What happened next occurred in less than 3 seconds but would be analyzed and discussed by inmates and staff for months afterward. Sofia had moved with a fluidity and precision that seemed almost supernatural, deflecting Rodriguez's weapon while simultaneously controlling her attacker's momentum and redirecting it into the steel table with devastating effect. Rodriguez had struck the metal surface with enough force to fracture the steel door of Sofia's cell, crashed open at 3:17 a.m. with the kind of violent precision that announced the beginning of operations designed to shatter psychological defenses through sleep deprivation and disorientation. 6 guards in full riot gear flooded into the cramped space, their movements coordinated with military efficiency that went far beyond standard correctional procedures. Sofia had been awake for the past hour, her internal clock and tactical instincts warning her that something significant was approaching. But the speed and overwhelming force of the assault was designed to prevent any organized resistance. "Reeves, on your feet. Hands behind your back." Captain Morrison's voice boomed through the specialized helmet that distorted his features into something inhuman and threatening. The guards moved with practiced brutality, forcing Sofia into restraints that included not just handcuffs but leg shackles and a transport belt that effectively immobilized her upper body. The equipment was military grade, designed for transporting the most dangerous prisoners, and its application sent a clear message about how the administration now viewed her threat level. Carmen had awakened during the commotion, but she immediately rolled over and faced the wall, understanding instinctively that witnessing whatever was happening could result in her becoming a target as well. Throughout the cell block, other inmates had retreated into defensive silence, the sudden absence of noise creating an atmosphere of tension that indicated everyone understood they were observing something that went beyond routine prisoner movement. Sofia was dragged through corridors she had never seen before, past security checkpoints that required biometric identification, and through doors that sealed behind them with the finality of vault locks. The route took her deeper into the facility's infrastructure, past mechanical rooms and storage areas that suggested they were moving toward the mysterious wing that Elena had identified through her financial analysis. The air grew colder as they descended, and the institutional lighting gave way to harsh fluorescent strips that cast everything in stark, clinical shadows. The destination was a room that bore no resemblance to anything that would be found in a standard correctional facility. The walls were lined with one-way mirrors. Sophisticated recording equipment was visible in ceiling mounts, and the furniture included a chair that was clearly designed for restraining subjects during extended interrogation sessions. Dr. Holloway was present, along with 3 individuals that Sofia didn't recognize, but whose bearing and attire suggested backgrounds in intelligence, operations rather than corrections. "Please, secure the subject in position 7, said a woman, whose voice carried the kind of calm authority that Sofia associated with senior intelligence officers. She was approximately 50 years old, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, and possessed the kind of controlled intensity that suggested extensive experience in psychological operations. Her identification badge listed her name as Dr. Sarah Chun, but Sofia's training told her that this was almost certainly an operational alias. The restraint process was conducted with medical precision, incorporating monitoring devices that would track Sofia's vital signs, stress responses, and neurological activity during whatever procedures were planned. The equipment was far more sophisticated than anything typically used in correctional settings, suggesting capabilities for real-time psychological assessment that extended into experimental territories that might not be approved for standard use. "Lieutenant Commander Sofia Reeves," Dr. Chun began, consulting a file that was considerably thicker than any standard correctional record. Navy SEAL, 15 years of service, extensive combat experience across multiple theaters of operation. Your psychological profile indicates exceptional resilience, advanced training in resistance to interrogation, and leadership capabilities that have proven effective in the most challenging operational environments. Sofia remained silent, recognizing that any response would provide information that could be used to refine whatever psychological manipulation was planned. Her SEAL training had included extensive instruction in surviving enhanced interrogation techniques, and she understood that the key to maintaining psychological integrity was to reveal nothing about her mental processes or emotional responses. "We know that you didn't commit the crimes for which you were convicted," Dr. Chun continued, her voice maintaining the same calm professionalism. "We know that Colonel Thornfield orchestrated your downfall as part of his work for an international criminal organization. We also know that you've been gathering intelligence about the corruption at this facility and planning an escape attempt." The revelations were delivered with casual confidence, as if Dr. Chun was discussing routine administrative matters rather than admitting to a massive conspiracy that included framing an innocent officer and operating an illegal detention facility. Sofia's training helped her maintain external composure, but internally she was processing the implications of what she was hearing and calculating how this information might be used to her advantage. "What we need to understand," Dr. Chun said, leaning forward slightly, "is whether you're prepared to work with us to expose the syndicate and eliminate the threat they represent to national security. Your skills, your motivation for revenge, and your knowledge of military operations make you an ideal asset for the kind of operation we're planning." The offer was presented as a choice, but the circumstances made it clear that refusal wasn't really an option. Sofia was strapped to a chair in a secret facility, surrounded by people who possessed detailed knowledge of classified operations, and facing individuals who had already demonstrated their willingness to manipulate legal proceedings and fabricate evidence to achieve their objectives. The question was whether cooperation would lead to genuine freedom or simply a different form of imprisonment. Colonel Thornfield is scheduled to attend a classified briefing at the Pentagon next week. Dr. Chun continued, producing photographs and documents that provided detailed intelligence about Thornfield's movements and security arrangements. The briefing involves representatives from the syndicate who are planning to steal advanced weapons technology. This represents an opportunity to gather evidence that would expose the entire network. But it requires someone with your specific capabilities to infiltrate the meeting and document what occurs. Sofia studied the materials while maintaining her silence, noting that the intelligence was far too detailed and current to have been gathered through standard surveillance methods. Someone within the syndicate's organization was providing information to Dr. Chin's operation, suggesting a level of penetration that indicated this. Confrontation had been planned for months or possibly years. The operation would require you to escape from this facility in a manner that appears completely authentic, Dr. Chun explained. You would be provided with resources and support, but it would need to appear as though you achieved your freedom through your own capabilities. The manhunt that followed would be genuine, but certain information would be withheld to ensure you maintained freedom of movement. The complexity of what was being proposed was staggering. Sofia would essentially become an unwitting participant in an intelligence operation, while believing that she was acting independently to clear her name and expose her enemies. The psychological manipulation required to maintain this deception would extend far beyond her. Escape and would potentially continue for months as she pursued targets that had been selected by people whose agendas she couldn't fully understand. Why should I trust you? Sofia asked, speaking for the first time since being brought to the room. You've already demonstrated your willingness to destroy innocent lives to achieve your objectives. How do I know this isn't just another manipulation designed to serve purposes I can't see? Dr. Chun smiled with what might have been genuine respect. You shouldn't trust us. Trust is irrelevant in this situation. What matters is that we're offering you an opportunity to destroy the people who actually betrayed your teammates and your country. Whether you trust us or not, Colonel Thornfield and the Syndicate represent genuine threats that need to be eliminated. The logic was flawless and deeply cynical. Sofia's personal desire for revenge would motivate her to pursue targets that served broader national security objectives, regardless of whether she understood or approved of the methods being used to manipulate her actions. She would be a weapon aimed at enemies of the state, and her effectiveness would be enhanced by her belief that she was acting independently. The choice is simple, Dr. Chun continued. You can remain here for the next 25 years, gradually deteriorating under conditions designed to break your psychological resistance. Or you can accept temporary cooperation that will allow you to achieve justice for your fallen teammates, while serving your country's interests in ways that your normal military career never could have. Sofia understood that she was facing a decision that would define the rest of her life. Refusal would mean genuine imprisonment under conditions that would eventually destroy her psychologically and physically. Acceptance would mean becoming a tool in operations that extended far beyond her understanding or control. Neither option offered the kind of redemption she had hoped for, but one provided the possibility of eventually exposing the truth about what had happened to her. The monitoring equipment attached to her body was recording every physiological response, providing Dr. Chun with real-time feedback about Sofia's emotional state and decision-making process. The data would be analyzed by specialists who understood how to interpret stress responses, cognitive load, and the subtle indicators that revealed whether someone was moving toward cooperation or resistance. I need details about the operation, Sofia said finally. Objectives, timelines, support resources, extraction procedures. If I'm going to risk everything on this, I need to understand exactly what I'm getting into. Dr. Chun's smile broadened slightly. That's exactly the kind of professional approach we were hoping for. The operational briefing will begin immediately. But first, there's something else you need to understand about your situation here at Blackwater. The revelation that followed would fundamentally change Sofia's understanding of everything that had happened since her conviction. Dr. Chun explained that Project Nightfall had been designed specifically around Sofia's capabilities and psychological profile, that her placement at Blackwater had been arranged to provide her with the motivation and skills necessary for the operation they were planning, and that every challenge she had faced had been carefully orchestrated to prepare her for what was coming. Your escape won't be an escape, Dr. Chun said with clinical precision. It will be a deployment, and your success or failure will determine not just your own fate, but the security of operations that extend far beyond anything you've been exposed to in your previous military career. Sofia realized that she had been maneuvered into a position where she had no real choice but to cooperate, but she also understood that the operation offered her the only realistic opportunity to expose the truth about her conviction and destroy the people responsible for the deaths of her teammates. The price would be her independence and quite possibly her life, but the alternative was certain destruction in a facility designed to break even the strongest individuals. The transformation from prisoner to operational asset was about to begin. And Sofia understood that the woman who eventually emerged from this room would be fundamentally different from the decorated officer who had been betrayed and imprisoned 10 weeks earlier. The security breach alarm that shattered the pre-dawn silence at Blackwater 3 days later was not the chaotic cacophony of an unexpected emergency, but rather the carefully orchestrated symphony of an operation that had been planned down to the smallest detail. Sofia moved through the darkened corridors with the fluid precision of someone who had memorized every angle, every blind spot, and every weakness in the facility's security infrastructure. During her weeks of careful observation and intelligence gathering, the escape had begun at exactly 2:47 a.m., when a precisely timed power fluctuation disabled the primary surveillance system for 37 seconds, just long enough for Sofia to exit her cell using tools that had been strategically placed by maintenance workers who were unknowingly participating in Project Nightfall. The lock mechanism had been subtly compromised weeks earlier, designed to fail at exactly the right moment while appearing to be the result of Sofia's exceptional technical skills rather than outside assistance. Her route through the facility followed a path that avoided the guards who were conveniently positioned away from critical checkpoints due to a shift rotation that had been implemented just hours earlier. The timing was so precise that Sofia almost felt like she was following a script, each obstacle appearing exactly when her training would expect it and disappearing exactly when she needed to proceed. But her SEAL experience had taught her to accept tactical advantages regardless of their source, and questioning the convenience of her opportunities would have to wait until she was safely outside the prison walls. The first major obstacle came at the security checkpoint that controlled access to the administrative wing. According to the intelligence she had gathered, this barrier required both keycard access and biometric verification, making it essentially impossible to bypass without authorization. But when Sofia reached the checkpoint, she discovered that the electronic lock had malfunctioned, displaying an error message that indicated a system failure requiring manual override by maintenance personnel. More significantly, she found a maintenance uniform that fit her perfectly, complete with identification badges and tools that would allow her to move through the facility without attracting attention. The uniform had been left in a supply closet that should have been locked, positioned exactly where someone with her route knowledge would look for resources. The convenience was almost insulting in its obviousness, but Sofia had no choice but to use the materials that had been provided. The transformation from inmate to maintenance worker was completed in less than 90 seconds, a process that included not just changing clothes, but altering her posture, gait, and facial expression to match the identity she was assuming. Her Navy SEAL training had included extensive instruction in operational disguise, and she understood how to become invisible by embodying the expectations that people had for routine service personnel. Moving through the administrative wing in her new identity, Sofia encountered 3 guards who barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through restricted areas. Their inattention was so complete that it suggested they had been specifically instructed to ignore maintenance activities during this particular time period. The realization that her escape was being facilitated rather than genuinely attempted was simultaneously reassuring and deeply troubling. The external security barrier presented the most significant challenge of her route. The perimeter wall was 20 feet high, topped with razor wire, and monitored by motion sensors that would trigger immediate response from armed guards. But Sofia had identified a weakness during her weeks of observation, a drainage culvert that passed under the wall and emerged in the woods beyond the facility's security perimeter. The culvert was protected by steel grates that should have been impossible to remove without specialized equipment. But when Sofia reached the access point, she discovered that the bolts had been loosened just enough to allow manual removal. The passage through the drainage system required Sofia to army crawl through a concrete tube barely large enough for her body, a claustrophobic journey that lasted nearly 20 minutes and emerged in a creek bed half a mile from the prison walls. The physical challenge was exactly the kind of test that would demonstrate her exceptional capabilities while providing a plausible explanation for how she had achieved the seemingly impossible, emerging from the culvert into the cold mountain air. Sofia found herself in wilderness that extended for dozens of miles in every direction. But rather than the complete isolation that should have awaited an escaped prisoner, she discovered a cache of supplies that had been carefully hidden near the emergence point. The cache contained civilian clothes in her exact size, emergency rations, basic medical supplies, and most importantly, a satellite communication device that would allow her to contact outside resources. The communication device came with pre-programmed coordinates and a message that provided her with the location of additional resources and contacts who would assist her in pursuing Colonel Thornfield and the syndicate. The message was unsigned, but it contained information about Thornfield's activities that could only have come from sources with access to the highest levels of military intelligence. More disturbing was the message's assumption that Sofia would choose to pursue her former commanding officer rather than simply fleeing to a country without extradition treaties. Sofia understood that she was being guided towards specific targets and objectives, but she also recognized that the operation offered her the only realistic opportunity to clear her name and expose the people responsible for destroying her life. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated, but it aligned with her genuine desire for justice in ways that made resistance almost impossible. She would pursue Thornfield because he deserved to be exposed, regardless of whether her actions served broader intelligence objectives that she couldn't see. The first 48 hours of her freedom were spent moving through wilderness terrain that tested every aspect of her survival training, while following a route that led inevitably toward the resources and contacts that had been prepared for her use. She encountered several opportunities to change direction or abandon the mission, but each alternative led toward dead ends or increased exposure to law enforcement agencies that were conducting an increasingly intensive manhunt. The manhunt itself was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to maintain the illusion of genuine pursuit while ensuring that Sofia maintained the freedom of movement necessary for her mission. Local law enforcement agencies were provided with accurate information about her escape and capabilities, but critical details about her likely routes and resources were withheld or delayed. The result was a search effort that appeared thorough but consistently arrived at locations just hours after Sofia had moved on. Media coverage of the escape emphasized Sofia's dangerous capabilities and her potential for violence, creating a public narrative that would justify extreme measures if her eventual capture or elimination became necessary. But the coverage also included subtle suggestions that she might be seeking to expose corruption in military or intelligence operations, providing her with potential allies among journalists and activists who might assist her mission. The first major milestone in Sofia's operation came when she made contact with Marcus Webb, a former intelligence operative who had been monitoring Project Nightfall's activities and who possessed information about the syndicate's penetration of military command structures. Webb had been expecting her arrival and provided her with detailed intelligence about Thornfield's activities, including schedules, security arrangements, and the identities of other syndicate operatives within the government. "They told me you'd be coming," Webb explained during their brief meeting at a remote cabin that served as a safe house. "They also told me that you probably don't understand the full scope of what you're involved in. The people who arranged your escape aren't necessarily your allies, but they're definitely enemies of the syndicate. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy is the best partner you're going to find." Webb's intelligence package included not just information about Thornfield, but evidence of the syndicate's broader operations, including their theft of advanced weapons technology, their infiltration of NATO military commands, and their coordination with terrorist organizations that threatened American interests worldwide. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving hundreds of operatives across multiple countries and extending into the highest levels of several allied governments. "Thornfield is just one piece of a much larger puzzle," Webb continued. "But he's a critical piece. His access to classified technology and his position within the Pentagon make him one of their most valuable assets. Eliminating him won't destroy the syndicate, but it will significantly disrupt their operations and provide intelligence that can be used to identify other operatives." The evidence that Webb provided included financial records, communication intercepts, and photographic surveillance that documented Thornfield's meetings with known syndicate operatives. More importantly, it included details about an upcoming operation in which Thornfield would personally transfer stolen technology to syndicate representatives, providing an opportunity to gather evidence that would expose the entire network. Sofia studied the intelligence, with growing recognition that she was being positioned to serve as more than just an instrument of revenge. Her actions would provide the intelligence community with plausible deniability for operations that could never be officially sanctioned, while her personal motivation for justice would ensure her complete commitment to the mission regardless of the risks involved. She was the perfect operational asset, skilled, motivated, and completely expendable if the mission required sacrifice. The realization that she was being manipulated by people who viewed her as a disposable tool was deeply troubling. But Sofia also understood that the mission offered her the only realistic opportunity to achieve justice for her fallen teammates and clear her name. The price of that justice might be her life, but the alternative was accepting permanent dishonor, while the people responsible for Chun and Martinez's deaths continued to profit from their betrayal. As she prepared to move toward the next phase of her mission, Sofia reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by forces beyond her control. The decorated Navy SEAL who had been betrayed and imprisoned was becoming something entirely different, a ghost operating in the shadows of the intelligence world, pursuing enemies who had never even acknowledged her existence. Handcuffs that had once symbolized her imprisonment had been replaced by invisible chains of manipulation and necessity that bound her to a mission she couldn't abandon and couldn't fully trust. But those same chains were leading her toward the people responsible for destroying everything she had valued, and Sofia was prepared to follow them wherever they led. Regardless of the cost to herself or the people who were using her, the hunt for Colonel Thornfield was about to begin. And Sofia understood that she had become a weapon aimed at the heart of a conspiracy that threatened everything she had sworn to protect. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Baltimore had been selected for the final confrontation, not because of its strategic advantages, but because it provided the kind of dramatic setting that would satisfy the psychological requirements of everyone involved in the operation. Sofia crouched in the shadows of the building's upper level, watching through night vision equipment, as Colonel Marcus Thornfield arrived for what he believed was routine meeting with his syndicate contacts to finalize the transfer of stolen quantum encryption technology. The 6 months since her escape from Blackwater had transformed Sofia into something that existed in the gray spaces between legitimate government operations and the kind of activities that appeared in no official records. She had pursued Thornfield across 3 continents, gathering evidence of his betrayal while simultaneously serving as an unwitting instrument of Project Nightfall's broader objectives. Every success had been carefully orchestrated, every revelation strategically timed, and every piece of evidence she had gathered had been analyzed by intelligence specialists before she even knew it existed. Thornfield entered the warehouse alone, his confidence suggesting that he had no awareness of the trap that had been prepared for him. At 54, he had aged considerably since Sofia had last seen him, the stress of maintaining his double life evident in the gray pallor of his skin and the nervous energy that accompanied his movements. He carried a briefcase that contained not just the stolen technology, but also documentation that would implicate dozens of other syndicate operatives if it fell into the right hands. The meeting was scheduled to include Viktor Petrov, the arms dealer whose compound had been the site of the ambush that killed Chun and Martinez, along with Dr. Sarah Chun, the same intelligence officer who had recruited Sofia at Blackwater. Though Thornfield knew her by a different name and believed she was working for the syndicate rather than against it, the complexity of the deception was staggering, involving multiple layers of false identity and misdirection. That would have impressed Sofia if she hadn't been positioned as one of the primary targets of the manipulation. Sofia's position in the warehouse's upper level provided her with clear sightlines to the meeting area while remaining concealed from the participants below. Her equipment included not just weapons and surveillance gear, but also recording devices that would document everything that occurred during the confrontation. The intelligence community would have complete records of Thornfield's admissions, the syndicate's operational methods, and the evidence needed to justify whatever actions followed. Psychological preparation for this moment had been as important as the tactical planning. Sofia had spent months processing the betrayal by people she had trusted, the deaths of teammates who had relied on her leadership, and the destruction of a military career that had defined her identity for 15 years. The anger and desire for revenge had been carefully cultivated and channeled, transforming her into a weapon that would pursue justice with the kind of relentless determination that couldn't be manufactured or faked. When Petrov and Dr. Chun arrived, the dynamic in the warehouse shifted immediately. Petrov moved with the predatory confidence of someone who had survived decades in the international arms trade, while Dr. Chun maintained the careful composure of an intelligence professional who was managing multiple deceptions simultaneously. The conversation that followed would reveal not just the scope of the syndicate's operations, but also the extent to which Sofia's own government had been willing to sacrifice her for the greater good. "The quantum encryption protocols are complete," Thornfield announced, opening his briefcase to reveal documentation that represented years of classified research and development. With this technology, the syndicate will be able to monitor and manipulate military communications across NATO command structures. The strategic advantages are incalculable. Sofia's recording equipment captured every word while she struggled to maintain operational discipline despite the rage that threatened to overwhelm her tactical judgment. Thornfield was casually discussing the betrayal of military secrets that would endanger thousands of American service members, speaking with the same tone he had used during routine briefings when she had trusted him completely. "The price we discussed remains acceptable," Petrov replied, producing a device that would transfer substantial funds to accounts controlled by Thornfield. But we need assurances that your position within the Pentagon will remain secure. The recent investigations into Project Nightfall have created concerns about operational security. The mention of Project Nightfall created a moment of tension that Sofia observed with growing understanding of how completely she had been manipulated. Dr. Chun's reaction was almost imperceptible, but Sofia's training allowed her to recognize the subtle signs of someone managing information that could expose her true loyalties. The realization that even this confrontation was being orchestrated for purposes she couldn't fully understand was both infuriating and oddly reassuring. Nightfall was contained. Thornfield replied with confidence. Reeves was eliminated during her escape attempt, and the investigation concluded that she was responsible for the security breaches. My position is more secure than ever. The casual dismissal of her supposed death triggered something in Sofia that went beyond anger into a cold determination that had been forged during her darkest moments in Navy SEAL training. Thornfield had not just betrayed her and her teammates. He had convinced himself that his actions were justified and that his victims were acceptable casualties in a larger game that he couldn't even comprehend. Sofia's descent from the upper level to the warehouse floor was accomplished with the kind of tactical precision that demonstrated why Navy SEALs were considered the most elite special operations personnel in the world. She moved through shadows and blind spots with perfect silence, positioning herself behind cover that would allow her to control the confrontation while remaining protected from potential threats. Her approach was timed to coincide with the moment when all three participants would be focused on the technology transfer rather than perimeter security. Colonel Marcus Thornfield, Sofia announced, emerging from concealment with her weapon trained on the man who had destroyed her life. You're under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of Sergeant Chun and Petty Officer Martinez. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Petrov reached for a concealed weapon with the reflexes of someone who had survived countless dangerous situations, while Dr. Chun stepped back with the kind of controlled movement that suggested she had been expecting this confrontation. But Thornfield's response was pure shock, the color draining from his face as he confronted someone he had believed was dead. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "You died during the escape." The reports confirmed what you needed to believe," Sofia replied, her weapon remaining trained on Thornfield while she monitored the other participants with peripheral vision. "Just like the evidence that convicted me was exactly what the tribunal needed to see. The question is whether you're smart enough to understand what's really happening here." The standoff lasted for 17 seconds before Petrov made his move, drawing a pistol with practiced speed while attempting to use Thornfield as cover. But Sofia had been expecting exactly this response, had been trained to anticipate and counter threats from multiple directions simultaneously, and had positioned herself to control the tactical situation regardless of how it developed. The firefight that followed was brief but decisive. Sofia's first shot disabled Petrov's weapon hand, her second shot shattered his kneecap, and her third shot sent him crashing to the warehouse floor with injuries that would require immediate medical attention, but wouldn't prove fatal. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 seconds, demonstrating the kind of tactical proficiency that justified every moment of the brutal training that had created her capabilities. Dr. Chun had not attempted to interfere, instead observing the confrontation with the detached interest of someone who was monitoring an operation rather than participating in it. Her reaction confirmed Sofia's suspicion that this entire scenario had been orchestrated to provide the intelligence community with the evidence and confessions they needed while maintaining plausible deniability about their methods. "You have a choice, Marcus," Sofia said. returning her attention to Thornfield while keeping Petrov under surveillance. You can cooperate with a full debriefing about the syndicate's operations, or you can join Petrov on the warehouse floor. The outcome is the same either way. The syndicate is finished, and you're going to spend the rest of your life paying for what you did to Chun and Martinez. Thornfield's confession lasted 47 minutes and provided intelligence about syndicate operations that extended far beyond anything Sofia had imagined during her months of investigation. The conspiracy included operatives within NATO command structures, coordination with terrorist organizations across 3 continents, and theft of military technology that had already resulted in American casualties in classified operations worldwide. The scope of the betrayal was so extensive that Sofia began to understand why extreme measures had been necessary to expose it, but the confession also revealed the extent to which her own government had been willing to sacrifice her for operational necessity. Her conviction had been orchestrated not just to provide cover for the investigation, but to create the psychological conditions that would transform her into the kind of weapon that could penetrate the syndicate's security measures. She had been betrayed, imprisoned, and manipulated not by enemies of the United States, but by people who claimed to be protecting national security interests. The irony is beautiful, isn't it? Dr. Chun said as federal agents arrived to take Thornfield and Petrov into custody. You've spent 6 months seeking justice for a betrayal that was actually part of a larger operation designed to protect your country. Your anger and determination were real, but they were also exactly what we needed to achieve objectives that couldn't be accomplished through conventional methods. Sofia lowered her weapon but maintained the tactical awareness that had kept her alive during months of operating outside official channels. What happens now? Do I get my life back, or do I become a permanent asset for operations that don't officially exist? Dr. Chun's smile contained genuine respect mixed with the kind of pragmatic calculation that characterized intelligence professionals who dealt in human lives as strategic resources. That depends entirely on what you want your life to become. The woman who was convicted of treason is officially dead. The woman standing here has capabilities that make her invaluable for operations that serve national security interests. You can disappear completely, or you can help us finish what we started. The choice represented more than just a career decision. It was a fundamental question about who Sofia would become after everything she had experienced. The decorated Navy SEAL who had trusted her government and believed in institutional justice was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood the gray spaces where necessary actions intersected with moral ambiguity. She could pursue redemption, or she could accept transformation into something that had never been intended, but might prove to be exactly what her country needed. As Sofia walked out of the warehouse into the cold Baltimore morning, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of having achieved justice for her fallen teammates, but also the knowledge that she had become part of a shadow world where patriotism and betrayal were often indistinguishable, and where serving your country sometimes required accepting that your country might be willing to sacrifice you for the greater good. The marble corridors of the Pentagon stretched endlessly before Sofia as she made her way toward a meeting that would officially close one chapter of her life while opening another that she still couldn't fully comprehend. 3 years had passed since the warehouse confrontation in Baltimore, and the woman who walked through these halls bore little resemblance to the decorated Navy SEAL who had once trusted implicitly in the righteousness of her government and the clarity of her mission. Her dress uniform displayed ribbons and commendations that told only part of her story, the part that could be acknowledged in official records. The hearing room was smaller than Sofia had expected, populated by faces that represented the intersection of military command, intelligence oversight, and political necessity. Admiral Rebecca Harrison, no relation to Colonel Harrison, who had first recommended Sofia for advanced training, served as the presiding officer for what was euphemistically described as a career transition review. The proceedings were classified at the highest levels, attended by individuals whose names appeared on no organizational charts, but whose influence extended throughout the national security apparatus. Lieutenant Commander Sofia Reeves, Admiral Harrison began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades navigating the complexities of military, justice, and operational necessity. You have served your country with distinction under circumstances that required extraordinary personal sacrifice and exceptional professional competence. Today's proceedings are designed to formally acknowledge your contributions while establishing the framework for your continued service. The acknowledgement was as close to an apology as Sofia would ever receive from the institution that had branded her a traitor, imprisoned her in a black site facility, and manipulated her into becoming an unwitting instrument of intelligence operations. The formal language couldn't erase the months of psychological torture, the destruction of her original identity, or the transformation of her moral framework from one based on institutional trust to one grounded in pragmatic necessity. Deputy Director Blackstone sat at the far end of the conference table, his expression revealing nothing about his role in orchestrating the events that had brought them all to this moment. The man who had supervised Project Nightfall had been promoted twice since Sofia's escape from Blackwater, his success in eliminating the syndicate's NATO penetration having enhanced his reputation within the intelligence community. He studied Sofia with the detached interest of someone evaluating the long-term effectiveness of a complex operation. The evidence gathered through your investigation resulted in the identification and elimination of 47 syndicate operatives across 14 countries, Admiral Harrison continued, reading from a summary that reduced 3 years of dangerous operations to a series of statistical achievements. Your actions prevented the theft of quantum encryption technology, disrupted terrorist financing networks, and eliminated threats to American personnel that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties. Sofia listened to the recitation of her accomplishments with the kind of professional detachment that she had developed during her transformation from military officer to something that existed in the shadows between legitimate government operations and activities that could never be officially acknowledged. The woman being described in the Admiral's report was competent and effective, but she bore little resemblance to the idealistic young officer who had once believed that serving her country meant following orders and trusting in institutional justice. The most significant revelation came when Dr. Chun entered the hearing room carrying files that contained the complete history of Project Nightfall and Sofia's role within it. The psychological manipulation that had begun during her court-martial had continued throughout her escape and investigation, with intelligence specialists monitoring her emotional responses and adjusting external circumstances to maintain her motivation and effectiveness. Every success had been facilitated, every revelation had been carefully timed, and every choice had been guided by people who understood how to transform personal trauma into operational advantage. The question before us today, Dr. Chun announced, is whether Lieutenant Commander Reeves will accept permanent assignment to operations that require her unique combination of skills, experience, and psychological resilience. The work involves activities that cannot appear in official records and requires individuals who can operate effectively outside normal command structures. The offer was presented as an opportunity, but Sofia understood that refusal would result in her disappearance into a bureaucratic limbo that would be indistinguishable from elimination. People who knew what she knew about government operations in the gray spaces between legitimate activity and necessary deception couldn't be allowed to return to civilian life or conventional military assignments. She could accept transformation into a permanent shadow operator, or she could accept termination disguised as early retirement with full benefits. But Sofia had also learned during her 3 years of operations that she had developed capabilities and perspectives that made her uniquely valuable for work that needed to be done but couldn't be accomplished through conventional methods. The skills that had been forged during her SEAL training and refined through her experience as an unwitting intelligence asset made her effective at operations that protected American interests while maintaining plausible deniability for the government officials who authorized them. "I have conditions," Sofia said, speaking for the first time since the proceedings began. Complete operational autonomy, access to intelligence resources without oversight restrictions, and authority to terminate operations that conflict with my assessment of American interests. "I'll work for you, but I won't be controlled by you." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds as the assembled officials processed the implications of what Sofia was demanding. Operational autonomy for someone with her capabilities represented a significant risk, but it also offered opportunities for achieving objectives that couldn't be pursued through normal channels. The question was whether the intelligence community was prepared to trust someone whose loyalty had been forged through betrayal, rather than institutional indoctrination. Admiral Harrison's response revealed the pragmatic calculation that governed decision-making at the highest levels of the national security apparatus. "Your conditions are acceptable with appropriate modifications. You'll report to an oversight committee that includes representation from multiple agencies, and your operations will be subject to post-action review. But you'll have the operational autonomy you're requesting, along with resources that will make you one of the most capable independent operators in the intelligence community." The agreement that Sofia signed that day established her new identity as someone who existed in the permanent twilight between legitimate government service and the kind of activities that appeared in no official records. She would pursue targets that threatened American interests, but her methods would be limited only by her own moral framework and the practical requirements of operational security. The decorated Navy SEAL who had been betrayed and imprisoned was officially dead, replaced by someone who served the same country through means that would never be acknowledged or celebrated. The years that followed tested every aspect of Sofia's training, resourcefulness, and psychological resilience. She operated in environments where the traditional rules of engagement didn't apply, where success was measured by results rather than methods, and where failure could result in her elimination by the same government that had created her capabilities. Her missions took her to places that appeared on no maps, pursuing people whose existence was classified at the highest levels, accomplishing objectives that protected American lives while maintaining complete deniability for the officials who authorized her actions. The most challenging operations involved former military personnel who had been recruited by hostile intelligence services, situations that required Sofia to confront people who had once served the same ideals that she had embraced during her own conventional military career. These missions forced her to make decisions about loyalty, betrayal, and justice that had no clear answers, and they gradually transformed her understanding of patriotism from simple institutional loyalty to something more complex and personally defined. But the work also provided Sofia with a sense of purpose that had been missing since the destruction of her original identity. She was protecting American lives and interests through methods that conventional military operations couldn't employ, and her effectiveness was measured by the threats that never materialized, rather than the public recognition that she would never receive. The woman who had once sought glory and advancement within military institutions had become someone who found satisfaction in achievements that could never be acknowledged. Irony wasn't lost on Sofia that her greatest Service to her country came through activities that could never be officially recognized, pursued by methods that would be condemned if they were revealed, against enemies who would never be publicly identified. She had become exactly what Project Nightfall had intended, to create a weapon that could be deployed against threats that endangered American interests while maintaining complete separation from the government officials who authorized her actions. 10 years after her escape from Blackwater, Sofia stood on a beach in the Caribbean, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the Oregon coast where she had grown up. She carried no identification that would reveal her true identity, possessed no official status that would connect her to government operations, and maintained no relationships that would provide enemies with leverage against her. She had become a ghost who served her country through methods that ensured she could never return to the life she had once known. Sofia had also discovered that freedom came in many forms, and that serving something larger than yourself didn't require institutional recognition or public acknowledgement. The woman who had been betrayed, imprisoned, and transformed against her will had become someone who chose her own missions and defined her own methods of protecting the country that had created her capabilities through means that could never be officially acknowledged. The handcuffs that had once symbolized her imprisonment had been replaced by invisible bonds of purpose and necessity that connected her to work that mattered more than personal recognition or conventional success. She had learned that Navy SEALs truly didn't need keys, not to escape from physical barriers, not to unlock institutional resistance, and not to open doors that led to forms of service that transcended traditional military careers.